We're trying to answer the question between the Christian worldview, the atheist world, not just the Christian worldview. Let's don't even look at that. Anybody who believes in a God, period. Your worldview versus the worldview of an atheist, okay? And the question is, why does anything exist at all? We have to go back to that question because as we go through this, without that question in your mind, this stuff is kind of hard to understand. So if I was to ask you as an individual, why does anything exist at all? And I was to ask you the question, you would have to answer that question to me. Why does anything exist at all? Is there a reason for it to exist or not? And as we talked about last week, there's only really two answers. Either it exists necessarily, just because it exists, or things exist, the universe exists, and everything exists because it has a reason or a creation of its existence. So remember that as we start going through this and talking about this, and we'll try to go really, really, really slow. If it takes us a couple weeks to finish this chapter, that's fine before we get into some of the other arguments. And I will tell you, some of the other arguments and stuff we talk about later on in all this is a little bit easier and more dumbed down than this one. But this is a big question. Why does anything exist at all? So I'll let Pastor Rich start at the premise 2 part, and we'll go from there.
So we're going to go really slow.
Really slow, so I can understand.
Not like that, right?
That's fine with me.
All right, so premise 2 that we're talking about is if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Okay, so that's the second premise we're talking about. All right, and then he goes with a lot of gobbledygook that we're going to skip. So basically, if atheism is true, then the universe does not have an explanation of its existence. And we had a guy here last week that said that atheists did not necessarily believe that way. He said that they believe that there is an explanation, they just don't know what it is. You know, so kind of what we were talking about in the pastors' meeting, they're taking the leap of faith to say there's an explanation that is unknown versus us with our leap of faith saying there's an explanation that is known, which is God. All right? So Pastor Ray actually said that a Christian comedian named Mark Lowry has said it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. And you said someone else has a book.
Yeah, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Frank Turek.
So think about that, the amount of faith it takes to say you don't believe in God, especially, again, we've talked about it before, when you look around at the evidence around you, just in nature. I mean, these guys are from Tennessee, so I know they've seen the mountains. If you guys ever been somewhere like the mountains and just the grand majesty, beauty of it, and look, and you don't just stand in awe of God's presence and everything, you know, to me, it's like, this is amazing. This didn't just happen. Again, we're back to the watch in the woods. It didn't just happen. So what's the explanation, all right? So this is precisely what the atheist says in response to premise 1, that it has no explanation. The universe just exists inexplicably, but this is logically equivalent to saying if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. All right? So we'll stop there. If the universe has an explanation, atheism is not true. So, what are some explanations you've heard atheists give for the universe? All right? The most popular one is the Big Bang Theory. Mm-hmm. All right? Not just the show with Sheldon and Leonard, you know, the actual theory that everything was created from a Big Bang. But again, you can't create something from nothing. There wasn't just nothing and then a bang happened. There had to be something there to create a bang. Yep. And to send all of these planetary bodies and stars and solar systems hurtling out into space. And that's something that you can't just get that from nothing. Something caused something to exist. Nothing didn't cause something to exist.
Right.
If that makes sense. You understand what I'm saying? Something can't come from nothing, all right? So you cannot confirm, A, that if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation, and then deny, B, that if it has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. But B is virtually synonymous with premise 2. Just compare them. So by saying in response to premise 1 that given atheism, the universe has no explanation, the atheist is implicitly admitting premise 2 that if the universe does have an explanation, then God exists. All right? So again, what he's saying is that if the atheist, what was his name? I didn't even catch his name last week. I'm a bad person.
I forgot.
Okay. If I forgot, said William Lane Craig. It's a plant.
It's over, bro.
He's in here making
The
sure
book.
we're doing his story right. If he said that he believes there's an explanation, then what our author is saying is that explanation has to be God.
Right.
You know.
And he's saying what he said there. So what Pastor Rich just read. If atheism is true, if the atheist is right, the universe has no explanation for its existence. Right? So if the atheist is true, then the universe has no explanation. But the counter to that is that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. Okay? So you have to get this before we move on any further. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation for its existence. But if the universe has an explanation, then atheism is not true. So what he's saying is the atheist would have to agree to that second one. The atheist would have to agree that if the universe has an explanation, then atheism is not true. It has to agree to that, right? If atheism says that the universe doesn't have an explanation for its existence, they'd also have to say that if it does, then they're false. Is basically what it's saying. Either it does have an explanation or it doesn't. If it doesn't, the atheist is right. If it does, the atheist is wrong. Right. So you have to get that before we move on. Either it does have an explanation or it doesn't.
Again, going back to what he said last week, he was saying, we do believe that there's an explanation, we just don't know what it is.
Right.
All right, you remember him saying that? All right. But again, that's where I was kind of going earlier with the faith thing. You're saying that there's something out there that caused all this or created all this.
Right.
You know, something caused everything to be into existence. There is an explanation for why it's all here. But then you're saying, I'm not going to accept the explanation as being God.
Right.
So you're basically counteracting your own statement.
You're admitting that
basically
it's
saying,
God.
You're saying, I believe that something caused it. I have belief. Right, but this something was not God. But I don't know what it was. Again, if you don't know what it was, why couldn't it be God? You're admitting that there's a cause.
That there's a cause.
An explanation.
Right. So they've admitted in that there's a cause. So in other words, at what point in studying it do we ever find out that what the explanation is to the atheist then? To the atheist that says, well, we know that there's an explanation, but we don't know what. When will you ever know what? When will you ever know? How will you ever know? And what is your explanation going to ever be? To us, it's God. That's the explanation. It's pretty cut and dry for us. So logically, when they admit that there's an explanation, they're admitting that the explanation is God. But they don't want it to be God. In fact, before we read any further, I did watch a video earlier, and this is what William Lane Craig says in the video. He says, if you don't want to call it God is the reason for everything's existence. If you don't want to call it God, then call it this: the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, external being who created the entire universe and everything in it. Just call it that if you don't want to call it God. Because ultimately it is something, and if there's a reason for the existence of all things, then that would have to be what it is. Don't call it God. That's fine. But there's a reason for it. So
now we're going to get into another argument for premise 2. The cause of the universe, is it an abstract object or an unembodied mind? Does everyone understand the term abstract? If you don't, wave at me. Don't be embarrassed. You don't understand it? Or abstract is something that is kind of impotent, something that doesn't really have an effect on anything. It's like almost like a mathematical equation or something.
yeah, like abstract art. You ever seen abstract art where it's just a bunch of lines and shapes,
Yeah,
just
it
abstract?
doesn't really have any real meaning. Where concrete is something that's real, it's physical, you can touch it, you understand it, you know.
Right.
So, all right, besides that, premise 2 is very plausible in its own right. For think of what the universe is. The universe is all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. I tried to create a new word out of those two words, matter.
It's okay. It's matter and energy together.
It's
Matter. It's
right.
good.
You use that word in school from now on, and you'll get high marks.
Yeah.
It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause must be a non-physical, immaterial being beyond space and time. Amazing. Now, there are only two sorts of things that could fit that description. Either an abstract object like a number or else an unembodied mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's what it means, or part of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause any effects. So the cause of the existence of the universe must be a transcendent mind, which is what believers understand God to be. All right? So again, he's just given an explanation of God. Mm-hmm. All right? Try to explain God to somebody who doesn't understand God, and it's not an easy task. You know, try to explain God to an unbeliever or an atheist or something like that. It's not easy, but he's done a pretty good job here. He is a transcendent mind. We can't necessarily understand what God is. We try to.
Right.
Our pictures since childhood have this long, gray, flowing beard sitting on the throne, you know, and he's got a sheep in one arm and just kind of looking over and doling out rainbows here and there and things like that. But, you know, he's not even a physical being. The physicality of God came in the form of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So that is what we often think of as Jesus when we think of God. God is spirit. You know, God the Father is spirit. And anytime in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that you see a physical manifestation of God, is what we came to know as Christ, as Jesus, you know. So he was active and present in the Old Testament as well. But he's a transcendent mind. He's so far and above, beyond what we can even think that we can't explain it. Again, he exists necessarily. He had no beginning. He had no creator. You know, if God had a creator, then that's the one we would be worshiping as God's creator. You know?
That's right.
He's the one, you know, the only thing that's had creators are the angels or us or things like that. God himself exists necessarily, and through him, all things were made.
Yeah, and another thing too, think about this. Time doesn't create time. Okay? So when you talk about time, space, matter, energy, them things, when you think about them things, we think about it as from our perspective. But remember, them things had to be created. All them things had to be created. Okay? And in order for them things to be created, it had to be created by something that was outside of time, space, matter, and energy. Okay? They could not have been created in and of themselves. They had to be created by something that's not affected by that. It's almost like taking a bubble, and this bubble's God, and inside that bubble is a little small bubble, and that little small bubble is time, space, matter, and energy. The thing that's not affected by time, space, matter, and energy had to create that. It doesn't just create. It doesn't just happen. Time doesn't create time. How did time start? Well, time was created. It's something that we're affected by, that God is not affected by. That's why he was able to create it. So, anyway.
So I hope you begin to grasp the power of the argument. If successful, it proves the existence of a necessary, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal creator of the universe. This is not some ill-conceived entity like the flying spaghetti monster, but is an ultra-mundane being with many of the traditional properties of God. This is truly mind-blowing, and if in case you're wondering, ultra-mundane just simply means beyond the realm of our world. So it's basically like saying supernatural.
Yeah.
All right.
And he was being facetious there.
Yeah, there is no flying spaghetti monster because Casey ate it.
Yeah. It was on buffet, and I ate it all. But he was being facetious there. He said, man, it's like almost like just like God. Basically being very facetious in that whatever created it had the same characteristics of what we consider God.
Right. Yeah, and that's just like what Pastor Casey was saying a minute ago, when they were saying you might as well call it this, and went on in all these explanations, because I don't want to say God exists, but this higher mind that,
Right.
that something created it. And even he admitted last week, he believes that there is a reason, that there's a reason for its existence. The thing where we differ on is what is the reason. We have an answer.
Right.
He doesn't. I work in a grocery store. Most of you guys know that. Some of you work with me, in fact. But we used to have a truck driver that delivered to our store that was an atheist. And I never tried to get into an argument or debate him or whatever, but, I had my beliefs and he had his. And he was talking to my cousin, who was actually working in the deli at the time. And she was trying to convince, he said, look, if God is true, prove it. And I said, if God is not real, you prove it.
Prove it. That's right. The burden of proof is on you.
The universe itself, I said, everything around us, I said, is proof of God's existence. As I said, I don't have to prove it.
That's right.
You prove that he doesn't exist. And that's kind of what, you say the universe exists for a reason. What's the reason? You don't have an answer, but I do.
Right.
You don't agree with my answer? Give me a better one.
And like Pastor Rich is saying, it actually is a good think about it question. Okay, let's say that he's right. Let's say that the boy was right. God is not is the reason for the existence. Then what is the reason? I mean, that's the ultimate question you have to ask. It's the question of the entire chapter. What if it is not God? What is your explanation for the existence of life and earth and time and space and matter? What is the explanation? That's the question. Explain that. If it's not God, is there anybody here that would like to take a jab at that? Just one jab at, well, this could be the explanation for all things if it were not God. I mean, we can be devil's advocate here. We can play the atheist that views that there's a reason for the existence of all things, but that reason is not God, right? We can play the devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. If anybody wants to play devil's advocate and give it a reason for that, then I would love to hear it. I would love to hear a reason for the existence of all things if it's not God.
But here's my thing also. If you were, say, debating someone in college or in class or whatever, and they ask you a question pertaining to your faith, and your answer was, I don't know, they would rake you over the coals.
Big time.
There. You proved my point because you don't have an answer. That's kind of what we were saying in the pastor's meeting,
yeah.
that I don't know is not always an acceptable answer in the Christian faith. But they're okay with it. that was exactly his response. And I wouldn't even be bringing it up if he was here tonight because I wouldn't want him to think I was picking on him. I really, truly wouldn't. So I'd have been really careful, but he's not here, and I don't know doesn't cut it. Yes, I believe there's an explanation.
Right.
I don't know what it is.
Right.
If we gave that explanation for something, why do you believe God exists? Well, I don't know. That's not good enough.
That's right.
So, again, that makes for a weak argument. If someone asks you a question, and you may not know the answer, I'd rather you say, let me find out, or let me get back with you. Because if you just say, I don't know, that makes for a weak argument. Why do you believe like you do? I don't know.
Basically what they're saying is, well, there's probably a reason for the world to exist, but that reason is not God. I mean, it's almost, it's kind of unbelievable, to be honest with you. You have faith in an I don't know answer rather than an answer that God. I mean, it's like, why would you choose I don't know over God in your answer? And a lot of the reason why a lot of people do that is because they're running from the God.
Right.
They're running from that. They know
the reality and the consequences.
Yeah, they know that logically God is the answer, but they don't want to accept that because if God is the answer, then there's a lot of consequences to God being the answer. Things like your sins and things that you do wrong and the need for a Savior because we can't save ourselves and things like that. Then you fall into a whole new line of there's a lot of things that I then have to accept if there is a God. So I mean, I'll let you keep reading, but that's really good. I mean,
I have found too that a lot of it is that a lot of people that are atheists are extremely smart.
yes.
And deep thinking. And God is hard to explain
Yep.
even for a Christian.
Yep.
Because I believe in God, but how he does what he does or how he did what he did, I have no clue.
Right.
I can't even fathom
Right.
that because we're human and we can't.
Right.
We'll never know. And for someone that is a deep thinker and likes to know scientifically things,
Right.
there is no explanation
Right.
for some of that. And I think that may be why it's hard for them to accept.
It is.
Because
And
they
that.
can't explain God.
That's right. And the truth of the matter is we can't explain God. The Bible says that God's unsearchable. God's immeasurable. Even the Apostle Paul said, great is the mystery of godliness, how he manifested in the flesh. And, we try to explain the Trinity and Jesus and all that stuff. But the truth of the matter is we don't fully even comprehend it ourselves. So you're exactly right. You're exactly right. That makes it tough. But still in essence, a God that makes more sense versus I don't know, it's kind of like weighing out the odds,
So here's an alternative. The universe exists necessarily. In other words, it just exists because it does. Just the same way what we've said about God. God exists necessarily. They're saying now that some of their alternative arguments might be, well, the universe just exists because it's necessary to exist. All right? So what can the atheist do at this point? He has a more radical alternative open to him. He can retrace his steps, withdraw his objections to premise one, and say instead that yes, the universe does have an explanation of its existence, but that explanation is the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. For the atheist, the universe could serve as a sort of God substitute that exists necessarily. In other words, the universe itself, the planets, the stars, the entire kit and caboodle, are in their mind a God-like substitute.
because it exists necessarily because of its own self. It's basically what he just said. That would have to be their logical argument.
Again, what we say about God, God was not created.
Right.
God exists because he is God. He exists necessarily. The atheist could now retrace his steps and say the exact same thing about the universe. It wasn't created. It's always been because it's necessary to be.
Right.
Okay? Now, this would be a very radical step for the atheist to take, and I can't think of any contemporary atheist who has, in fact, adopted this line. A few years ago at a Philosophy of Time conference at Santa Barbara and City College, I thought that Professor Adolf Grunbaum, a vociferous atheistic philosopher of science from the University of Pittsburgh, was flirting with this idea, but when I raised the question from the floor whether he thought the universe existed necessarily, he was positively indignant at the suggestion. Of course not, he snapped, and he went on to claim that the universe just exists without any explanation. So, again, how does it just exist?
Right. And what he did there is he showed that they do not want to accept the fact that it exists necessarily. It just necessarily exists because then it's creating its own God. Then the universe becomes its own God, so they don't want to accept that. Therefore, they have to accept the fact that it has zero explanation for its existence without God.
The reason atheists are not eager to embrace this alternative is clear. As we look about the universe, none of the things that make it up, whether stars, planets, galaxies, dust, radiation, or what have you, seem to exist necessarily. They could all fail to exist. Indeed, at some point in the past when the universe was very dense, none of them did exist. But someone might say, what about the matter that these things are made of? Maybe the matter exists necessarily, and all these things are just different configurations of matter. This is where it gets real deep.
Yep.
The problem with this suggestion is that according to the standard model of subatomic physics, matter itself is composed of tiny fundamental particles that cannot be further broken down. The universe is just a collection of all these particles arranged in different ways. But now the question arises, couldn't a different collection of fundamental particles have existed instead of this one? Does each and every one of these particles exist necessarily? Anything to say? But that blows my mind right now.
He's just saying that there would have to be different sets of particles. Essentially, what he's saying is either these particles are necessary or they're not. It's kind of what he's saying in simpler terms. What he's saying is they would break it down to the smallest minute particle of existence. Instead of looking at it from the bigger picture, it's breaking it down to the smallest particle. So it's he describes it in a really tough, really deep way. That makes it even harder to break it down to in a layman's term, to be honest.
And he's actually got a little chart here of all the known particles, but...
Here, I'll read this part. I'll read the analogy. I'm going to read he gives an analogy, actually. This kind of helps. He said, to see the point, think about your desk. Could your desk be made of ice? Notice that I'm not asking if you could have an ice desk in the place of your wooden desk that had the same size and shape. Rather, I'm asking if your very desk, the one made of wood, if that desk could have been made of ice. The answer seems to be an obvious no. The ice desk would be a different desk, not the same desk. Similarly, a universe made up of different particles, even if they were identically arranged as in this universe, would be a different universe. It follows then that the universe does not exist by necessity of its own nature. Now, someone might object that my body remains identical over time despite a complex exchange of its materials,
Constituents.
Constituents. For new constituents, we're told that every 7 years, the matter that makes up our bodies is virtually completely recycled. Still, my body is identical to the body I had before. Where am I at?
Analogously.
Huh?
Analogously.
Oh, I went down to analogies and disanalogies. Analogously, someone might say, various possible universes could be identical, even though they're composed of wholly different collections of particles. So, see, basically what he was saying is something can't be made up of something different if it is what it is. So, anyway, I think we can skip that right there, Pastor Rich.
Yeah, but basically, again, he's saying, and he used a desk analogy. Just think about the chair you're sitting in. All right, it's made out of cloth, and it's made out of steel, and it's made out of this and that. But in your mind, you never think it's made out of ice. You know, you know it is. You can shape ice to look like the chair, but this chair is not ice.
Right.
You know, it's not made out of different particles from what it's made out of, and that's kind of what they're arguing if they're saying the universe exists necessarily. All right, they're saying, okay, what about the subatomic particles that make up everything?
Right.
And what he's saying is we've all got the same basic makeup. That doesn't change. Again, there's not something that exists necessarily. It's something that has been created. And that's basically all he's trying to say in a really long, roundabout, complex way that gives me a migraine. So he's basically just saying that no, the universe, whether it's the huge vastness of it or the most subatomic particle, none of it exists necessarily. It was all created by a necessarily existing God.
Right. Let's see. Trying to figure out, do we need to just go to conclusion here?
Yeah, because all this stuff, like all these particles and stuff, is crazy.
Yeah, it's just like I said, like we said, it's really, really, really deep, and when you go into the particles and stuff. So here's the conclusion. We'll conclude this chapter. Actually, I thought we might take time, but I think we've done a good job at the beginning trying to explain the necessity part and why does everything exist. And I think, as Miss Joyce said, actually Miss Joyce brought up the really good point earlier. And you know, without the explanation being God, that's kind of like he said the other day. That's kind of what it amounts to. Is not all atheists will say there's no explanation. Some would say that there's an explanation. They just don't know the explanation. We think the explanation is God, and you know, we have a little bit more logic to that explanation than what they do. But in conclusion, he says this. He says, given the truth of the three premises, the conclusion is logically inescapable. God is the explanation of the existence of the universe. Moreover, the argument implies that God is an uncaused, unembodied mind who transcends the physical universe and even space and time themselves, and who exist necessarily. This conclusion is staggering. Leibniz has explained our minds far beyond the mundane affairs of daily life. In the next chapter, our minds will be stretched further still, and we try to grasp the infinite and discover the beginning of the universe.